All right, and we're in. How you doing today?
I'm okay. I've survived the. This is all immediately going to sound like SNL, the Californian sketch, but I've survived the drive from Silver Lake to Beverly Hills. I used to say there are women that would have relations with me that I wouldn't make that drive for, but I don't even know if that's true anymore. But
It's really hard getting people to come across the 405.
I haven't quite crossed the 405. Not that's the Rubicon, but it's always a journey. I've got certain hacks, but this is going to mean nothing to anyone outside of this immediate municipality. So
I don't think people understand how bad the traffic really is here.
there are ways, if you know certain secret, and you can get into these kind of slangy matches with people like, go on Beverly, and you're like, no, I know if I stay on Franklin, it will
Get better.
yeah.
It'll get better at some stage.
Dog, I'm even overriding all the technology that's telling me to tell. Like I happen to know that if I stay on this course, I will get there quicker. And then it's like, oh, you're right. We shaved 7 minutes off this anyway.
I think LA is probably one of the only towns where you're like where the local drivers are actually better than Google Maps.
Yes, in this case, I definitely had the drop on on my car technology.
Yeah.
But that's a measure of how excited I am to chat that I made the grand. It's a sort of equivalent of Leopold and Loeb or whatever of the 21st century, going from Silver Lake to Beverly Hills.
A grand gesture. I love it. So look, you are a music composer. You make music for some massive movies, studios, independents. I mean, like, can we just go back a little and figure out where you're from?
Go back, or I mean, maybe I'll just attack what I do now for a living, which is, it's strange because it's both sort of so parochial and so just its own little thing. Like just now, I mentioned that we're working on, it's no huge secret, the new Superman movie. And you said, oh, is there a new Superman movie? And like in my life, everything is about the new Superman movie and just million needs and everyone trying to crack this. Well, but we basically work mostly in the world of promo, which again, it seems so obvious because we're in it. But, you know, we have these movie trailers basically. And I think people are a little more up on it now. And there are whole subcultures of people who love the trailers and the kind of event that comes with that, which has almost superseded the movie itself, I think. But these trailers need music in them. And I think a lot of people feel like, well, isn't that just the music from the movie? But over the last sort of 15, 20 years, it just has become that's not the case. Partly because it's the same 7 or 8 big composers doing all the scores for all these big movies. And quite often they're not even really finishing the score until the movie's like days away from coming out even, you know. So there often isn't that music available put in the trailers, but also the trailers require this kind of other level of, I think it's a bit of a hacky idea, but on steroids, you know, often telling a full kind of 3-act idea within these trailers that help to really punctuate the images. And it's a different discipline. It's funny, I ran into amazing, huge composer Harry Gregson Williams at an event, and he said, you guys are killing him. Can I swear, by the way?
Yeah, for sure. This is
They're fucking killing me with this trail. Like it's so like jacked up. But it's two different worlds, but they intersect, you know. But that's basically when they have a movie to promote, they have footage, and perhaps the studio has its own editing bay with some editors in, and then they also all these amazing out-of-house production companies and post-production companies that they farm the material out to. And then this is where my business is just so crazy, because within those companies, they have editors, 4 or 5 editors perhaps, and they each have different music people they like working with. And then there may be different creative things happen. Either they want an original piece of music, that's less and less. More often they might want us to orchestrate something famous from that movie. In the case of Star Wars, something like that, we do a lot of work with them, or Spider-Man, or, as I think everyone's probably noticed now, they maybe have a famous pop song or rock song that they want to kind of what's called trailerize, where you kind of jack it up, or you maybe, I often think we did this, the kind of singular one we did was for the Batman movie with Robert Pattinson, where they put Nirvana, you know, Something in the Way, and this was a huge deal. And this is the kind of stuff I have to be a little careful talking about, but I seem to remember we were working on that. It was going to be this kind of smoky detective noir thing, but then I think we played them some kind of these trailerizations. We kind of done for something else, and Nirvana was one of them.
Mm-hmm.
And I could be wrong about this, but I feel like they were like, oh, this is the thing. And then within weeks of that, they'd kind of rejigged the whole thing. This whole movie was supposed to be a kind of homage to Kurt Cobain and stuff. And I was kind of like, hold on, I'm pretty sure we suggested that. But, you know, and at the time, it seems like, God, there's so much sort of IP for people that you got new Batman and Nirvana, but it's almost like sugaring the cake a little more with another recognizable IP thing,
Mm-hmm.
a famous song or something that they would just want to have associated with that. But sometimes, say we did this beautiful campaign for that movie, The Creator, you know, the Gareth Edwards sci-fi thing. Do you see that on Hulu?
I haven't seen that.
But that had this Aerosmith thing, you know, Dream On. But it was like really just like a couple of lines of Steven Tyler singing over a kind of fully fledged orchestral kind of track behind it. And so it's strange because it's all predicated on that IP of Steven Tyler and just Dream On, you know, but all of the music is not from that song, but neither one can kind of exist without the other. So that's a big part of what we do, is trailerizing third-party stuff. But generally, these editors and these companies will ask us, do you have some original stuff, or would you try remixing this song, or, you know, if it's famous IP, could you do an orchestration of this? And then we present it, and then it's just this crazy, like, Wild West shootout where we have to kind of stay in these cuts, going kind of up the chain, and they keep getting shown to higher-ups and filmmakers and getting knocked out. And then, you know, since you're asking me about what we do, it's a strange situation where we don't get paid unless something actually finishes and wins in the campaign.
Mm-hmm.
But we have to somehow be the last man standing when that piece finishes, and then the studio calls me and say, hey, we got this trailer, it seems to have something of yours in it, what is it, what do you want for it?
Mm-hmm.
And then we work something out.
So, I mean, like, when you're composing music for a movie, you're working with a director. So when you're doing this work on the trailers and stuff like that, are you working also with the film director, or are you working with the studio?
We're getting somewhat nebulous feedback back that may be coming from the director if they're involved. Generally, probably coming from promo higher-ups at the studio, certainly the editors themselves and the producers. So it's, you know, I'm guessing the closer it gets to a finish, the more we're hearing stuff direct from filmmakers.
Yeah.
But it's a little hard to tell. It's sort of, you know, nebulous and not very well organized, but it has a sort of hierarchy of notes and stuff that I think are in some ways less complicated than, say, doing stuff for adverts or whatever, which we do sometimes, but there's a lot more cooks in the kitchen there, you know?
Yeah, I can imagine. That's interesting, though.
But we do score some film stuff, and it was interesting. My creative partner is a guy called Felix, a brilliant composer, and, you know, originally it seemed like we were sort of in this field with the goal being to score movies and stuff, you know, because that's felt like that was the kind of holy grail. But it, you know, there's a little bit of careful what you wish for there, because it's so much more. Like, I remember we scored a really fun TV show for Jon Favreau and Miles Miller, who's just done the Wednesday and the Beetlejuice thing,
Mm-hmm.
where they basically reached out and said, like, we're doing this show and we love what you do for trailers, and we want the whole kind of show to have this very elevated feel. And it was great, and we were so thrilled to do it, but there was, you know, it was such a different workflow, and, you know, I literally remember considering faking my own death about 3 weeks into it, just because I was like, this is just, it's so much of a different workflow, and ultimately, financially, there's a kind of reward in residuals and stuff, although that's a very shifting landscape with what's going on in the digital space and stuff. But
Right.
It used to be, you get paid pretty well, but then you really can get paid through residuals and repeat performances and performance royalties and stuff, where I'm not quite sure how that all lies now because we haven't done so much of it. But the idea with the trailers is very much like a one-time fee, no residuals, no back end, you know,
Mm-hmm.
but that at the same time, you can get kind of paid the same for 60 or 90 seconds of music that you might need to do 10 hours of music for a TV show to get the same money if we're just being as venal as to talk about how much money you can make.
Yeah, that's interesting though, that how much money that they put into the trailers and how much like excitement and how elevated they are and how they're trying to just grab people's attention any way they can, right?
I think it's huge because obviously, getting people into cinemas and getting off their couch. I experienced it myself, and I'm deeply invested in this industry, carrying on and being healthy. Some of this stuff is well discussed, obviously, but the degree to which this kind of confluence of Netflix's dominance in the streaming space and then the pandemic and then all these other big media and tech companies trying to get into the streaming space, sort of, I think just thinking that if they somehow created enough content and platformed it day and date, that they would somehow start to compete with Netflix. And the truth is Netflix has always had that first mover advantage. And in doing this, focusing so hard on, say, Disney Plus and platforming these movies online that you'd have to wait 3 or 4 months for them to come online. So you'd have to go to the cinema, and then sort of getting a little caught between these two stools of trying to build these subscription services, but also keep their theatrical business alive. And they kind of killed the golden goose a little bit, which is, it's all progress, and God knows technology will continue to kind of mix that up always. But I think right now we're seeing, never more before that William Goldman, saw of like nobody knows anything in show business is true, because every week it's like the movie business is dead, like because this movie underperformed, but then the following week, I'm trying to pull some titles out, but suddenly this one's doing 100 million in its opening week, and we're back, and then
Deadpool does $1 billion.
Deadpool was one of those where it seemed pretty obvious, and now with hindsight, you could say it was always going to be $1 billion. But I imagine even Kevin Feige was probably saying, we have experienced a couple of ones where the crowds didn't show up, and I guess they will, but you never know.
Yeah.
And speaking of that, we did a pretty successful piece. That's a perfect example. I think it's the second main trailer for that is Madonna.
Is that like a virgin?
It's like a virgin, yeah. And that was a piece that we did,
That song was in the movie too.
Which is often something that drives these things, And so, my role, although I have a history in production and songwriting to some extent, I'm mostly these days an agent. In the sense that we have a company that came together and we quickly kind of had a little bit more work volume than we could handle. My partners, say Felix, kind of really leading the line on the composing stuff, and I'm a bit more of a producer and a kind of tidier and a finisher, But we quickly found that we had to kind of look around and find people that could do the same kind of stuff, and we amassed this incredible little cadre of guys who I sort of think of as being like the Avengers or something, because it's literally like a guy in a castle in Switzerland and a guy in the outback of Australia and someone in London, and it's like these guys can do stuff that just blows me away. Like, I don't know how they do it, like making fully orchestral stuff, what we call in the box, that you might not believe me, but it's just better than the real thing, Like I working on these big movies is a certain level of secrecy and NDAs and stuff. I probably shouldn't name the movie, but a huge musical movie that wasn't a particularly loved thing, but we had done all the promo for it, and eventually the powers that be were like, well, cool, well, now we're gonna re-record this with the London Symphony at Lyndhurst or whatever, and they do that remote thing kind of and then everyone's kind of like, oh, finally this sounds the way it should. But there's a little bit of me that knows that it's kind of smaller than what we've done, and they just slowly, as that finishing process goes on, just start turning all that stuff down, and it ends up being our in the box thing, because it just, the technology combined with guys who really know how to use it, and I think it's 15, 20, 30 people in the world who can do it, makes for just this astoundingly real sounding, but muscular, very kind of up against the speakers sound, you know.
As a full orchestra.
It sounds like a full orchestra, but it doesn't ever. I mean, certainly there's some value sometimes in perhaps recording some real string section or some brass or choir maybe to kind of beef it up. But again, I'm in that world and I know how to do some of it, but the stuff that our guys do really just blows me away, you know. And also with these just great stuff that would 10, 20 years ago, we'd have been asked, and not that I was doing it back then, but that you would have had like 2 weeks to deliver, and now they're expecting it, you know, within on the same day, or stuff that you would like blanch. Like, how could that be done? You know,
that sounds stressful.
It's stressful. The whole thing's pretty stressful. If only because, as I say, it's an open, every job is this kind of open bidding process, and kind of a lot of super talented other people in the space. We all sort of know each other, and you know, it's a friendly competition, but people kind of piling in, thinking it's some sort of easy payday. And
how many people are in the musical business like you are, where you're doing the promotions and trailers for future films? Like, how many people in Hollywood do you think compete against you directly?
In the promo music space, I mean, again, they don't need to be in LA. It's certainly something we all learned from the pandemic experience. You could almost be anywhere. And I've always been a bit, I'm looking at your beautiful studio here and saying I'm a bit of a technological Luddite sometimes, particularly in doing music, pop production. It can be a bit of a kind of arms race where you start collecting compressors and synths, and there are some guys who do that and it's just so beautiful, and it's just aesthetically so beautiful, old gear and analog gear. But I never really got into that arms race. And I have genuinely produced, you know, some amazing people, Shakira and Paul McCartney and stuff, and I've never really done anything off of my laptop, you know, which seems sort of heretical, but once you get kind of used to the way stuff sounds, certainly coming up doing kind of pop music production where you'd mix it all on this giant SSL board and everything sounds great on the big speakers, and there's a lot of kind of music, there's memes about this, that you'll then go to your car, it just sounds like garbage, you know, and you're like, oh, we'll just stay up all night thinking about some snare drum didn't sound good. But there's something about knowing, just even visually, the way stuff looks in the box, you know, just on a laptop, that you can feel pretty sure that it's kind of representative and it's going to sound good, you know. And that's the crazy thing, that we're doing all this stuff that I never really hear off of laptop speakers. And then I'll sometimes, when I do get out to the movies, you know, you run this gamut of like 87 trailers before they show anything now.
Yeah.
And you're like hearing, and it's like, that's so exciting too. I mean, I think I went to see Dune 1, you know, big IMAX in Burbank, and it's like every trailer before was like Spider-Man, The Eternals, and, you know, a couple of others that we had done. And I'm literally kind of jabbing the guy next to me, like, we did this. And he's like, dude, I don't even know you. Like, but it's such a different experience to see it like blowing your hair back, you know, as opposed to just hearing it in this little tinny speakers. But somehow that's always been my way. Other guys have amazing rooms and stuff. But in terms of our competition, you know, there's 5 or 6 other companies doing a similar thing, and and then a bunch of other people kind of coming in all the time. And I feel, you know, these music supervisors we work with, I think it's hard for them. They have to kind of keep everyone sort of fed and watered, you know.
Yeah. Where do you, I mean, like, how many movies are actually being made these days compared to pre-COVID? Because I know things really slowed down during COVID. I know there's been a writer's strike. I know there's been an actor's strike. Like, are you seeing the volume of stuff coming through to you?
Weirdly, it's actually right now that not just we, but like as a kind of consumer, from a consumer perspective, wanting to go to movies, there's a weird like lacuna right now where there isn't much coming, you know? And that is, I think, a direct response to the strikes and some other stuff. And I think it's possibly a bit of a chimera, but, you know, there's this saying currently, survive till 25 in the movie biz, you know, because there is this idea that a bunch more stuff's going to come online next year. And now we're just sort of seeing a little bit of the stuff that was kind of held over and the uncertainty about the schedule. And so like I was worried about that. It's actually been a kind of spectacularly good year for us, mainly focusing on a few less projects, but maybe going a bit deeper into them. And I wouldn't say that promo is entirely insulated from those kind of downturns, but a bit like, bread and circuses in the Roman Empire. It's like the more that the studios are worried about people going to stuff, I feel like promo is a little bit protected from those vicissitudes of the marketplace, because if anything, when things are tough, they're going to perhaps focus more on promo. Just like whatever we have, we got to try to get people excited about this project in the first week and, try to get people out there. So we haven't experienced that too badly, but I definitely have noticed, particularly towards the end of this year, it's really dovetailed into sort of 4 or 5 projects that like everyone's working on,
Mm-hmm.
which can be pretty scary because you've got to just give so much time and effort to them, and you just have to hope that your thing is what's in there. At the end of that, the music definitely helps, but it may just be that someone's got a cut, an editor's got a cut with some minimal bit of music or just some magic that's working, and then they just toss everything else, And I'm not complaining, I'm touching wood. I'm so grateful for our business, but it is interesting to me how music really drives the culture. Certainly, as you notice, drives a lot of those trailers and drives film music and stuff.
All of advertising.
Yeah, but it's still by some kind of crazy conspiracy of silence almost. It's just been deemed that music is always this kind of last thing. It's the thing that, we don't have any budget for music. I mean, not in my space so much, but it's weird how, and again, I think I can say this, without prejudice, everyone else in the chain of what we do is being paid to do it.
Mm-hmm.
They're being paid to cut promo, fuck around, show them stuff that works, show them stuff that doesn't work. I understand all that. Just getting a handle on how to crack this finished piece, it's just still going to come down to a few subjective higher ups who are being well paid to make those decisions. But just that it is kind of crazy that the music people in my field particularly just don't get paid unless something gets used, and it seems wrong, if only because, people's lives, it's hard, and unfortunately we sort of curse ourselves by being so good at doing it that it becomes very easy for them to ask us for this and then ask us something else, and then almost sometimes you feel like they didn't even listen to the last thing, but they've had a new idea. And a lot of my business kind of managing my guys who they want to be in it, they want to try to win, they want the opportunities, but they also have to take time away from their families and their lives to do this stuff.
It's crazy that that someone can spend time composing music for a movie trailer or something like that, and then not get paid unless that piece is actually used.
It's so crazy, and I feel like sometimes I'm kind of involved in the conspiracy of insanity. And I guess I remember from being more on the creative side, because we started out, me and my partner, just making trailer music before we kind of became more agents, that we were mostly just wanting to have those opportunities and be in the mix on that stuff. And, we were more worried when we didn't get asked. And if something else won, we wouldn't be like, oh, fuck those people. We'd be like, well, they just did a better job than us. We need to up our game to be as good as them. So, I try to be compassionate with my guys, because I really do know what it's asking them to do to take their lives away from their families, and I'm just just be honest. If you can do it, if you want to try, and generally they do, I love them for it. But it's, when one sees collective action and unionization and what happened with the actors, and I have my feelings about that strike possibly not having been a great idea for a few reasons that I'm no expert on, but you do sort of fantasize about having some kind of unionization in our space, or getting together with the other guys who are at our kind of level, and just even daring to suggest that we have some kind of collective bargaining or set some sort of boundaries for what these people are able to ask us to do for nothing. But I just fear there would be too many outliers that probably perhaps some of my competitors might tune into this and take up my invitation to perhaps talk about. But, because as it stands, although I love my clients, I love the people at the studio, but if they ask us to do something and I were to dare to say, like, well, could we get paid for it? They just literally hang up and just call one of our competitors within 20 seconds, like.
So the whole musical industry around film and television and trailers and promotion.
Particularly.
Yeah. Not unionized. There's no collective bargaining agreement.
The union movement has always been kind of at its weakest around music. You have this thing called AFM in America, but not to besmirch them. I'm sure there are good people there, and I'm sure they're genuine, collectivist, unionist people. But as a union, from when I used to do more of that kind of work, it's pretty useless. I mean, they're just not really offering any help or healthcare or backing. It's really just they appear to be collecting dues, and so it's, like I say, it's strange. Music, maybe it goes back to something to do with troubadours, and that it's just never been. It's just is always it's dichotomous, and to the degree to which it both drives the culture and then is considered this kind of the last thing in the culture, where where you're kind of left knowing that, like, this movie, they're probably their one day, like, food budget, like, would have covered like 10 of these campaigns of our music stuff, but it's just that's not where they're thinking to do it. But I think doing film composing is much more civilized, but it's just a very narrow band of people who are really doing that at the highest degree. Names that you kind of know, that people like Hans Zimmer kind of changed that game and made it. I guess John Williams and Jerry Goldsmith, but that becomes almost part of the marketing of the movie itself.
Yeah, especially like Hans Zimmer has quite a public profile.
Exactly.
Yeah, he's out doing concerts all around the United States right now.
And he's very much the kind of kingmaker in that world. It's an amazing setup. But the idea is, I think they've softened that image a bit, but it was like you go into his world, which is this thing called remote control, and you work like just crazy work. You work on stuff like in these windowless rooms, and it's almost like working in Wall Street or something. You have to put in this incredible, brutal apprenticeship. And then if you can hold in there and not die, basically, then at some point, Hans will sort of trust you enough to be like, someone calls for some movies, like, well, I can't do it, but I got this guy, Benjamin Wolfish, or I've got this guy, Harry Gregson, or I've got, Tom Hogenberg, who's Junkie XL. Like, they were all people who came up through that world, and very much like this kind of Cinderella night that eventually, I have no idea if he maintains a kind of piece of the action or how that works, but he's very much the kind of conduit through which you become the next big film composer in that world.
So he just runs the whole thing.
He is definitely the man, it's funny because it's like, as there's scores, if you like music and atmospheric music, used to be a kind of uniquely creative space where I think, there's sort of almost hagiographic, like, love of like Vangelis score for Blade Runner or Goldsmith for Alien, or that you would listen to these things. It was where the really inventive music was happening. Certainly, just on a purely personal level, like, big movie scores now leave me pretty cold. Like, and again, I think it's just a function of they're just kind of churning them out a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also this phenomenon of what's called temp music, where often they'll edit the movie and they'll temp it with music from other movies,
mm-hmm.
and then sort of present that to the composer in a kind of like, well, this is working, but it needs to be a bit different. And, the composer's a little bit beholden to sort of follow at least the shape of it, and so it ends up being, I worked when I was a little kid for a very famous pop producer in England called Pete Waterman, who made that Rick Astley, Never Gonna Give You Up and stuff. It was this giant pop producer guy, a bit of a shuckster, a bit of a kind of P.T. Barnum character, but he once told me this great sort of analogy about, like, pop music's like chicken soup, like you start out with the pure stock, and then people just sort of take a bit of that stock and add it to water and try to put a bit more, but it ends up being this kind of rather thinned out kind of gruel by the end of too many people following. But and so you want to try to, like, get back to the pure stock somehow.
Mm.
And so certainly big film music, I think, has become a little anonymous, possibly because of the time frame to deliver that stuff and this temp phenomenon. But at the same time, really some of the most inventive music is going on in kind of indie film in that A24 world.
Mm-hmm.
Jeff Barrow from Portishead and Cliff Martinez and you know, those guys.
It almost sounds like there's too many cooks in the kitchen sometimes on some of these big movies, and that's how
Definitely, you know, there's no, you know, you certainly, someone like Christopher Nolan is interested in pushing those boundaries, and certainly his work with Ludwig, who I know a little bit, who's a great guy. You know, that's pretty avant-garde. I mean, it's, you know, and you'd listen to that. I sort of have this category of music I'd listen to for fun, you know. Certainly the scores to, you know, those big movies. What's the backwards? Tenet, and, you know.
Oh, Tenet, yeah, that was great. Right. Interstellar.
And Interstellar, you know, which is, again, it's sort of genuinely quite avant-garde in that, like, Hans will, if you listen to some of the Interstellar, if it's weirdly kind of small, like it's quite a narrow bandwidth stuff, and somehow it just totally works. Like it's not, I mean, you know, and even the influences are worn very strongly on the sleeve. Like if you listen to the final act of Philip Glass's opera, I can't remember the name of it, but it's got this same sort of organ theme, and it's just so close to Interstellar, but it kind of doesn't matter because he took it and made it his own thing out of it. But so those two worlds don't collide too often, and like I say, we all wanted to score movies when we got into this game, and certainly some of the guys I represent ought to be scoring movies because I think they would do a better job than, which is the more interesting job. They don't, it doesn't cross over that much, strangely.
Yeah. I mean, with so many studio executives and people in television and stuff being so risk averse, you can imagine everyone just goes back to the same well to drink from instead of trying new things and being creative and taking real risk.
I think that has percolated down in a pretty negative way in our space, in as much as, you know, congrats to people who've managed to get a job being a development or promo exec at a studio, but in a world where that's clearly thinning out because they're, you know, consolidating and losing money, and it's terrible when people are losing their jobs. Like, I have no wish for anyone to be in trouble in that way, but there's clearly a genuine fear among that kind of executive crowd that they're going to get fired. And, you know, there's so many ramifications. I mean, you could be glib and say, well, they don't get to send their kid to Harvard Westlake anymore and all this stuff. But, I mean, they have lives and bills and all, and I think, understandably, there's a lot of anxiety, which in our world means, you know, they just kind of think, well, if we just do one more remix or just change this, or maybe, like, you could understand them being more in just like, maybe this will be the thing that will push this movie into a kind of more positive place. And, you know, so we'll be getting up to version 47 or 48 of something, and then, you know, the fucking trailer will come out, it'll just be like a kick drum or something under it, and just be like, what, you know, it's deflating, it's hard, it's like really Sisyphean, pushing the rock up the hill, and then, and also, you know, you get to kind of celebrate these incredible victories for a few moments before it's just like the phone goes again and we're just starting over. When they are big, like we have this great relationship with the Star Wars crowd, you know, and back when we were kind of first getting into the promo space, we got a call from like J.J. Abrams' office, and they were like, you know, he really loves what you guys do, and we're doing this new Star Wars stuff with The Force Awakens. I feel like everyone now is a bit kind of over the Star Wars rebirth, but at the time, huge fucking deal, you know, genuine excitement knowing that JJ was going to kind of at least visually treat it the way the old movies were, and there'd been this kind of slight disappointment from the 3 George Lucas prequels, you know, which I know they've kind of grown in people's estimation, but it was like, this is big, you know? And we went into Bad Robot. I don't think I'm breaking any NDAs here or anything.
Yeah.
Literally, like, slept on the floor. They've got this beautiful studio there, just trying to, like, frack, like, what would be the thing to like reintroduce this franchise to people, you know, that's so important, just trying to go through the themes and stuff. And, you know, eventually we hit on this like Sarlacc pit, we call them blaps, that were from Jedi, I guess, you know, just this little moment of music, and it was like this, and we and it kind of worked, you know, and then we built that into a piece, and quite rarely for our game we then handed that off to John Williams, who just this incredible orchestration on it. And then that trailer came out for Force Awakens. I don't know if you know, remember, but it was like, it's just this like desert vista, and then John Boyega stands up into the frame and like looks around, and our music starts, and I mean, people were having fucking heart attacks and crying, and that was the first time they did these like tableau videos of like people reacting all around the world live, you know, and I'm like a real impact on people's.
Well, that first Star Wars, when it came back out, The Force Awakens, that was huge. I mean,
Yeah.
it was a multi-billion-dollar movie.
And it's a good, great movie, but it's just it was like, there are these moments that you can count where you're like, wow, we are really actually on the kind of penumbra of like the culture here, and bringing joy to people and stuff, which is, I don't know, it's silly, but it's cool to be involved.
Yeah.
And then that, you know, we've pretty much done major pieces for all the Star Wars stuff. Incredible. The best example I'm saying of this in the box stuff, there's a trailer for Obi-Wan Kenobi show that I guess ended up possibly disappointing slightly the show itself, but you know, just amazing in the box production that one of our guys did.
Oh, that was with Ewan McGregor, right?
Yeah. And you know, the show itself, I don't know, but that's what I'm saying. There's these trailers, they almost supersede the excitement about the movie itself, where watching the movie becomes this almost a bit of a chore, you know?
Well, it's true. I mean, like, you know, they're always reporting like how many people are watching the trailer on YouTube, and that's supposed to like be some kind
I think we have 4 of the top 10 most ever. But that's always because what the weird thing is like you have that, like, you know, that Force Awakens and Spider-Man and some Transformers spot we did, but then, you know, some like Sonic the Hedgehog trailer will come out, and I guess just because more people are looking now, that'll suddenly become the most watched trailer ever.
Yeah.
So, but I'm gonna, certainly at one point we had 4 of the top 10 most watched things ever, you know?
Well, that's got to be amazing.
It is amazing, and I'm so grateful for it. I mean, I think there's a lot of discourse around trailers, you know, the degree to which I think a lot of real movie fans are kind of eschewing them slightly at this point, because they're tending to tell a little bit too much of the story, you know, the whole movie.
Yeah.
Like, I don't, you know, if there's something I've kind of earmarked as having, I shouldn't be disowning my own trade here, but, you know, I'll kind of maybe steer clear of the trailer, like, to just have that more full experience in the theater of not necessarily knowing. I think there's a debate happening right now with the Speak No Evil. Are you aware of this horror movie that's around right now?
No, I'm not. What's going on?
Speak No Evil, which I haven't seen either, but it was a kind of Danish or a European movie that came out last year. It's a thriller about 2 couples that meet on vacation, and then one couple go to visit the other at their home. And since I had children and stuff, I find it hard. I used to love genre cinema, horror and stuff like that, but my appetite for seeing people brutalized I'm kind of find it like enticing, almost like a drug or something, but I tend to not indulge anymore, you know? But by all accounts, the original Speak No Evil is like unspeakably grim and scary and unpleasant, and just a harrowing experience to watch. Like, people were really talking about it in kind of slightly distasteful terms, even if they loved it, you know. And it's hard to know. I guess I'm intrigued if it's just a character-based thing. But anyway, they quickly remade it English language just now with a great cast and stuff. And even though apparently the original, because it's 2 people from different countries, are actually speaking English to each other, but I guess American audiences want American version. But
American audiences want Russians who speak with a American accent.
they can't handle a few subtitles. Although that's obviously gotten better. I shouldn't be glib about that. I think Netflix, weirdly, with a lot of subtitle stuff, has made people a lot more happy about to watch those. But anyway, they've remade it, but there's a bit of a stink going around right now that the trailer just tells the whole movie, you know.
Oh, it doesn't leave anything to surprise?
But I haven't seen the movie, so I don't know, but it certainly kind of tells the story, you know, of the meeting and being asked to visit them, and they go there and it turns ugly, and then by the end of the trailer they're, you know, knives are flying and blood and all that, which I guess that's the quandary for these execs, is how to get people excited about this stuff without giving it all away.
I think there's got to be some mystery to it.
I prefer that.
Yeah.
I mean, in general,
the trailer should have nothing to do with the movie other than to entice you enough with mystery and suspense that you want to go see it. I think that's the only reason why there is a trailer.
And yet they like to get a lot of info in them. And I think that musically and visually, certainly you've had a great kind of growth of slightly more interesting left field stuff, because there's been this great growth in the kind of mini major indie sector of A24 and Focus, and making a lot of horror movies, but in that kind of hereditary Civil War space, where the trailers also are tending to have more interesting, cool music, and that's something I'd definitely like to see more of.
Mm. So when did this whole journey start for you? Where are you from?
I'm from London, from West London, Portobello Road, Notting Hill Gate, around there. And as a kid, like, I was kind of unreasonably obsessed by like American dance music and club music, hip hop and house music. And it's something I've noticed, that when you're kind of a kind of semi-posh white boy from West London, and you're like about as far away from the Bronx or Detroit or Chicago as you could be, you tend to become a little extra kind of wonky and like learn everything you can learn and read the labels and collect everything and become just a bit extra, kind of what British people call train spotting, you know, just knowing all about, or there's another phrase, being an anorak, which is so hard culturally, but it's sort of the idea of just being a sort of just avid kind of consumer observer of something. So I became very entrenched in that world, where I was, even at the expense, so I'd never even listened to like rock music or, you know, which I love now, but I remember going into some studio and they said, oh, Robert Plant was just, I was like, hey, who's Robert Plant? Like, I didn't, honestly, I was like such a head for this just limited space.
So what was your era? Who were you listening to back then? What was your...
I'm saying early house music that was coming out of Chicago and Detroit and New York in the late, aging myself here, but I was very young, in the late 80s. And then this burgeoning hip-hop scene coming out in New York.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the earliest part of that, where you had the kind of Marley Marl, Queensbridge crew going up against the Bronx, you know, KRS-One crowd, like, that you were kind of reading about this stuff like they were superheroes and collecting these records, going to these import record stores, and I worked in some of those, and, you know, became quite a good like scratch mix DJ and stuff, just so sort of silly really, but and I got very into that, particularly, you know, as I say, house music was something that not only I love, but also the technology you could kind of buy, just this Atari ST 1040 computer, very early home computing thing, and I think you're supposed to say Akai, but an Akai sampler that would have like 250 MB of storage space, so you could sort of, it was a big box, but you could maybe sample one bit of vocal and one drum loop or something.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, these drum machines that Roland had made that had been built hilariously as like wannabe kids' toys that were supposed to sound like actual drums, but just were fucking they just didn't sound anything like drums.
Mm-hmm.
But they had these easy sequencing things, these famous drum machines, the 808, which is still a huge staple of pop music now, that has this big rolling big bass drum and little hi-hat, and particularly the 909 drum machine that were these kind of building blocks of house music. So you could pretty easily get together a kind of working setup to make club music, house music, and and I was kind of doing all right in that part of what was called like the UK garage. Garage was a kind of slightly grimy British version of the music that was mostly coming out of New York, the kind of second wave house music of Masters at Work and Todd Terry and people like that. And we were all just trying to just be like them,
And was this all like extracurricular, or was there like a program, like playing music in school?
Really, I came from a creative family. My father's a TV producer and very involved in the world of music, and I had been around a lot of amazing classical music. Certainly a little bit prejudiced they were from pop music and modern cultures, thinking it was all a bit worthless compared to Wagner and Beethoven. But I was lucky that because my father worked very closely with Leonard Bernstein and George Solti and these guys, that I would see these just incredible Bernstein doing Beethoven's Ninth with the Vienna Philharmonic, and like I'm a kind of 8-year-old bored as fuck, but I also like can viscerally remember that sort of sense of like my just hair being blown back by this music, that even now when I see great conductors and orchestras, it's still, you just know it's not quite up to that level, So I was around music and around a family where it seemed like that was kind of okay to pursue creative stuff. But really, no, I just was at university, and like I say, you could make these things and put them out or find a kind of distributor. Vinyl records, literally, that you'd sell a few thousand and you could make a living. And then if you got a little bit of a rep, which we did, then you might get asked to remix stuff. They would generally accompany most pop records with a house remix, that you can get paid $2 or $3 grand for, and that would build up that profile a bit more. And then
and this is all when you were like a teenager?
Yeah, like 16, 17, yeah.
Wow.
And I loved the music so much that I remember we called the guy I was working with, there's a guy called Derek May in Detroit who's part of this thing called the Belleville 3, that there's this word techno, that got kind of changed to mean this kind of Germanic sort of, pumping sort of industrial. But original techno was these 3 guys in Detroit who very cerebral guys, but also quite sort of jock-like black guys who were very into sports and stuff. But they were really aware of Detroit as a city and the fact that it was this kind of crumbling auto empire, and they just loved like Kraftwerk and Moroder and things like that. But they also loved like P-Funk, and so Derek May, who was the kind of middle of these 3 guys, who goes under the name Mayday, just I think a genuine 20th century genius, but he really devised this idea that techno would be this marriage of like P-Funk and Kraftwerk trapped in an elevator together, he said, And so they're making this very interesting, I mean, the first of those guys, what's his name? Fuck, I'll remember in a minute, but he made beats that, Missy Elliott samples stuff. He's still around, So but we actually called them up and said, like, we just love what you're doing, and like flew to fucking Detroit. Like I was 16. It was the scariest place. So you're from Canada, right? So maybe you've
close by.
Just like real like urban Detroit, went to this guy's place, and like, I don't think, because house music was kind of blowing up in England, but he hadn't really worked that out yet. I think he was like, why all these fucking like white English people? Like, because he said, like New Order called me last week. They want to come out here. And a guy called Gerald, all these people were paying this kind of, this homage, this kind of, what's the word when you go to the Mecca, kind of, to visit these guys. Pilgrimage to freezing cold, terrifying Detroit.
Yeah.
And went and again slept on the guy's floor and saw him make some incredible music, and so that's how into it I was.
Mm-hmm.
And that was kind of going okay, not like it wasn't like, again, we were just in awe of these American guys and just really trying to sound like them, you know.
Where does Moby fit into any of this for you?
Moby was around, really. I lived in New York when I was like in my late teens, actually working for Leonard Bernstein in his last years. And we and my partner, because we were still making this music, we DJ'd at a few places like Mars and Red Zone and stuff. And Moby, funnily enough, was there DJing as well, like right when he was starting.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I knew him back then a little bit.
There's a great documentary with him that he made himself, just about his life and stuff like that. And I find it absolutely fascinating.
Definitely an interesting guy. And then I knew him a little bit after that because his roommate Damien had this great apartment on Mott Street in Little Italy, and I knew him, and he'd go for a friend of mine. And then I see Moby around now just because I live in Silver Lake, and he owned this vegan restaurant that was kind of backed onto my property, and I'd see him there, and I'd sometimes say, "Hey, do you remember I knew you 20 years ago?" I don't think he remembers, but he was certainly he was a kind of third wave guy, but he made that track Go that samples that Tones on Tail Go, and he was with the Twin Peaks sample, and I respect his musical output a lot, you know. But so that was like doing this house music stuff, and then at a certain point trying to do a little bit more pop music, trying to do something that might chart, or, you know, and I kind of was involved with a couple of little pop things. But it's funny, I remember I did something that got on. There's a show called Top of the Pops in England. You know, heard of that?
I've heard of it, but I've never seen it.
This is kind of like flagship, like forever, back when there was more of this monoculture, and like what was number one in the charts, like really kind of mattered to people, you know. When I was growing up, this show on Thursday night, that everyone used to crowd around the TV, and it really had this big kind of cultural impact, what's number one or whatever. But I got something on Top of the Pops, and I went, and it just, everyone has this experience in some different way, but like it's just this tiny studio, like a kind of a little box, and just so sort of like disappointing, and just watching this thing I'd done, just like lip syncing on stage. And I think at that moment I was like, if this is everything I've been trying to do, like I need to get out of here. And I pretty much moved to America like not long after, because it's that idea of wanting to kind of crack this slightly bigger pond, you know.
For the Top of the Pops, like were you singing and composing?
Something I'd produced that was like a kind of minor top 10 hit, you know. But it was kind of like that was the kind of apotheosis of British pop music achievement, to have something on Top of the Pops. And
I think it's really interesting because like it seems like you were trying to work your way through like the UK music scene, and then I think you came into the same issue that everyone comes into. It's like if you want to produce music in English, you've got to come here.
Yeah, I mean, and it was interesting because I remember coming here with my sort of wares of like tracks and some playing them to some pretty high-powered American A&R people, you know, and just them being like, this is what you like. It was so far off. There's a sort of non-PC old saying of trying to sell sand to the Arabs, you know, like,
yeah.
You know, I had enough rep to kind of get these meetings, but even just being in there, I could hear like, yeah, this stuff's not that good, you know, like here you've got all these guys, Timberland and stuff, who are like so good, you know. But through a kind of confluence of circumstances that's got some legal stuff around it that I probably can't go into, I like found a guy, and that led to some big stuff happening. And then that sorry to be so nebulous, but I'm not really supposed to talk about it, but that ends up with me working at Sony at Epic Records doing A&R there.
Mm-hmm. And what's an A&R?
A&R, artiste and repertoire. That's the kind of old school and largely disappearing kind of middle role in the music business of technically the two sort of disciplines of like finding new talent, signing it, and then kind of helping them to make records and deal with their stuff. And, you know, this was how the great A&R guys, Ahmet Ertegun and Mo Austin, are these guys who built the careers of Stevie Wonder and people like that, who found them, signed them, were their, you know, producer, father confessor, you know.
Just pure talent management from top to bottom.
But and that role then became this kind of the middle of the music biz, where you had these possibly overpaid executives who kind of sort of became the celebrities in the music biz, the Clive Davises and stuff, who, you know, identified themselves so closely with their acts like Whitney Houston and stuff that they became almost more important than the artists, you know?
David Geffen.
Yeah. Amazing, talented people, but what happened in the music biz is it got a little bit hollowed out. Obviously, technology's just taken it to that whole place, but you had these kind of very top-heavy execs, and then in theory, we should have been these people in the middle who knew how to kind of find stuff and make records, and they just got sort of hollowed out. It's made a comeback because there's so much like history of music biz here, but you basically have two. Do you want me to give a little primer on how music biz goes?
Absolutely, I'd love it. You know, because it's funny, like, you know, you watch like Rocket Man, like Elton John's rise into America.
Elton, you're number one. That's always how those movies go.
That scene where he plays his first U.S. At the Troubadour, which is a block away from here. Like, that was amazing. But then you watch, like, David Geffen has a documentary. Like, all these people have these amazing documentaries about their world in music. But it's almost like that's the old world. Like, no one's talking about how this
still exists the same. But I mean, the main, I guess, like, secret sort of source of the music business is that it's cut in two halves. You basically have recorded music, which is a bit harder to put your finger on now. It's streaming. It's the physical incarnation of a song, which used to be a CD or a vinyl record, is now a file, and not even a file anymore. It's a stream. But that's I guess the easiest way to explain. So you've got the recorded side, and then you've got the composition side, the idea of a song, the words and chords and notes that exist in theory, and you can write them down, or you could embody them in a physical recording. And I guess the simplest way is covers, is like a song like, you know, Let It Be or whatever, is you've got the Beatles version of it, their recording of it, and they wrote it, but anyone can cover that song and make a new physical recording of it. And so there are two commodities, the physical recordings and the compositions. And that's generally known as like records or masters and publishing. And you know, for a long time, records kind of ruled the roost. You could sell 10 million records, and, you know, the record companies would steal most of the money off you and do all these weird packaging deduction stuff. But that's how you could make a lot of money, by selling records.
There's a great scene in a movie. It had Mark Ruffalo and Keira Knightley in it, and she was an up and coming music star, and they ended up producing her first album in the streets of New York. I can't remember what it was called.
I know it's one of that John Debney guy.
Yeah.
No, the guy that did Once, and Irish guy. Yeah,
the same guy. But it was funny because she went in to sign her record deal, and they're like, well, basically, you know, you get like $1 per record.
I mean, it's funny in the movies. It's like when you see worlds that you don't necessarily know, you think maybe it's like that, you know, and then you see your own field represented as like it's nothing like that. It's generally just a lot more bitty, but you could still make a lot of money by selling records. But just because of the way the radio was set up and stuff, you wouldn't get paid any royalties for your record being played on the radio, but the people who wrote the song would get paid royalties, you know. And back even in the Brill Building days, you basically had these like older Jewish guys writing all these hits that, you know, the Shirelles or whatever would sing. And these were these two sides of the business. Records, a lot of the same companies, Sony ATV Publishing and Warner Chappell Publishing, but two separate things. And slowly the value of recorded music, because of Napster and then, you know, like disappeared, basically. You couldn't really find a way to sell physical music to people because it became kind of worthless. You know?
Napster was crazy. That Napster came out when I was in university.
Yeah.
And we went from like all having DVDs and CDs to just all using...
Because you used to buy an album and listen through it, and, you know, but LimeWire and Napster really changed everything, where you suddenly had, and I think it was incredibly freeing and great, and pointless putting your finger in the dike to try to hold that back. And there's obviously the record company they were all panicking. And actually I have a funny story about that. When I worked at Epic at Sony, there was, you know, all this panic about people ripping CDs and putting them on LimeWire, and a real existential threat to the whole thing, because that's how they were making money. Because towards the end of the 90s, the beginning of 2000, there was billions of dollars being made from CDs in the era of Britney and Backstreet Boys, and maybe only like one song, but they were selling these CDs for like $13, $12, millions of them, and it was just making so much money for the music business. You could understand that they weren't thrilled about that going away, So when I was at Sony, they put this like $10 million something into like, we're going to make an unrippable CD, we'd pay these wonks to just make this technology that couldn't be beaten,
Mm-hmm.
And the day came that CD was coming out, and it came out, and then YouTube was pretty young then, but someone put up within 10 minutes a YouTube video where they got this CD and they took it out of the box, they got a black Sharpie, they drew a little ring around the inside of it, and they put it in the thing and ripped it. And basically, they were able to override the technology with a $3 Sharpie in 35 seconds, undoing. And it just showed me, more than like anything I've ever seen, that there was no holding that back, and nor should there be. I mean, technology is its own, engine. But
it's interesting though it's funny like how the goals of the record companies to like create a disc that can't be hacked was totally useless. But then you had like Apple and Spotify come along and be like, well, if we just collect all the music in one place and make it really easy to find and easy to use.
Apple was the first change to have iTunes, which was this great way to, and there's a lot of kind of almost anger among music fans of people who had these great libraries of iTunes files, and then when Apple shifted over to Apple Music or whatever, they basically hijacked everyone's iTunes folder and started saying, well, this isn't available and you have to have the streaming version. They basically kind of like took people's physical files away.
Mm-hmm.
and at the same time, Spotify is coming through, and again everyone's like, well, that can't work and that's not going to happen, and and the record companies really balked at that and try to hold it off, and but they just, a bit like Netflix, had that first mover advantage, and there was just no holding it back, and certainly that's a great paradigm, the idea of having all of recorded music at your fingertips, and if anything, I think that's still the kind of golden goose that the movie and TV business hasn't discovered, because they're all scrambling over these different services, and ultimately it's clear that there will be one or two services where you can kind of access everything, but they're a long way from that still.
Well, we're starting to bundle now, right?
Yeah.
And I think the bundling is the first step, and then I think at some stage, like the Paramounts and the HBOs and the Hulus, they're eventually just going to put all their stuff on Netflix and take a revenue split.
It's a sort of, it's just whether it's Paramount and Peacock merging or HBO, and they're trying to do it and it'll happen. But Spotify had the kind of balls to go for it, and the music was held off for quite a long time. But eventually, particularly Lucy and Grange, has this kind of pretty well, kind of made their deals, and so there was a period when recorded music was kind of dead, basically. Like, as a band, I used to say, like, if you were a band, what you wanted was like a record deal, and then a publishing deal, and then a manager, and then an agent, to do live touring. But that has literally flipped, that now, if you're a young band, you want an agent. You want to be out there playing shows, building an audience.
Mm-hmm.
Then you kind of want a manager to help make some stuff happen. Then you want a publisher, because as I'm about to say, that's really where most of the music's gone and money's gone in music, into the publishing game. And then maybe you want a record deal. If you're like an artist who's doing really well with millions of streams, but you want to like perhaps broaden your like global presence, or take things to a bit of another level, or you might do a record deal, but kind of like, why? Like, they're only really gonna take half your money away and not do that much for you. Sorry, my record company friends, of whom I have a few, but that's why you see these, particularly in the rap space, these guys are just building these like huge followings,
mm-hmm.
and then they may give a little something away to a record label, but this basically record labels stopped signing new talent as much as they can, because mostly they're minting money on their catalogs, which continue to do well. Classic rock and stuff is easily the majority of the business they do, and a lot of those companies aren't even really bothering to try to break new acts now and stuff, because it's just a bit of an impossible feat.
Well, I mean, if you're a new act, right, like, why would you even bother going to a record company? If you can get a couple million streams...
Nowhere you would, because you'd get money and then you'd feel like you're in the mix. But if you're, to be honest, somebody that a record company is looking at and being interested in, you probably slightly surpassed anything they could do for you at this point, So it's definitely interesting, because these are kind of hacky observations, but everything's become so balkanized, so little monoculture, that, like, say, I have a wonderful Canadian friend who manages bands, and he invited me to a show of a band he manages called Peach Pit, who you probably know. Do you know?
I don't know Peach Pit.
Big Canadian band.
No, the last big Canadian band.
Actually illustrates my point perfectly.
Yeah.
That I went to the Palladium or the Fonda or something, and I see on the banner 3 nights sold out, and I go in there and there's like 5,000 people just going nuts for this band Peach Pit, who are perfectly good. I couldn't necessarily sing any of their songs, but it was like real music, and they'd obviously build this audience, and they were simultaneously like, nobody knows them, including good Canucks like yourself.
Yeah.
And yet they were probably making a pretty good living, selling out 3,000 to 5,000 seat arenas around the world, or theaters, and having decent streams. But as is sort of boringly noted, you can have 58 billion streams and then get a check for like $3,000 or whatever. You really have to get to just an insane level of streams before you're going to make money from recorded music at this point. But having popular recorded music allows you to tour, allows you to sell merch. And I think if you kind of disengage from the sort of idea that you're going to be flying on private jets with Jay-Z, and maybe just see that it's like you can make a pretty good living from doing it. And it's weirdly the acts that sort of try the least hard, like Mac DeMarco or someone who are really built, just doing it and going on tour and going through these markets and building audience, and they can probably tour, really fruitfully for the next 40 years in a kind of, Grateful Dead type of way, and that's where the business is now, I guess at its most elevated, where you're seeing all these crazy touring numbers for Taylor Swift or whatever, or this current kerfuffle with Oasis, because I guess...
Oh, the ticket prices shot through the roof.
Yeah. Which I guess is this idea of the experience economy, or people are kind of wanting to spend their money on these unique experiences, Even I think there's a fair amount of buyer's remorse once you have to deal with stadium parking and $35 hot dogs or whatever, and it's just a show of some people. But people clearly are craving this in-person experience that's pushed live music to the head of things. But then, so weirdly, the kind of fourth wall of this is publishing, which is a little bit harder to get your head around, as I say, because it's the idea of a song, the intellectual copyright of a song, as opposed to a physical embodiment of it. And that is actually where all the money is in the music biz, because for whatever reason, terrestrial radio, which remains a bit of a force, even though they pay money to the songwriters, and not there's some, they've tried to rejig it slightly so the guy that played bass on some famous record might get a bit of royalties, but it's mainly the writers. And that's where, I guess, because it's freed of the production costs, it puts the onus on bands and labels to actually create physical versions of these songs. All it does is generate money from the exploitation of these songs, whether that be playing on the radio or played in a trailer or played in a stadium. And there's more and more places where music is driving the culture, and people want to have these famous songs. So that's why you've had this weird kind of gold rush, which has petered out a little bit now. But these companies like Hypnosis and all these funds who are kind of going around and paying huge money for the song, the composition rights to, people will say, oh, so Neil Young sold his catalog. Well, what he's really doing is a company's coming along and saying, right, I see that your songs generate $2 million a year in royalties. And really what they're just doing is banking. And they'll say to Neil Young and his people, we'll give you that 2 million multiplied out by 8 years plus another million because you'll do this deal with us, you know?
Yeah.
And there's a lot of debate about whether that's a good idea. I'm not using Neil Young. I don't know if he's done a deal like that, but, you know, that's a way for them to kind of get one big check against their staff. Obviously, then I don't know whether, depending on what kind of deal they do, if they're relinquishing, you know, the right to refuse the song being in a Trump campaign, however, I don't know. But
I think that's part of it. Like, I know like a lot of, quite a few musicians in the last like 4 or 5 years have done that as they get into their 70s. And you know what I think they do it is because I think their wills would be too complicated with their.
See how it's a way to sort of say, I'll just put everything in this one basket, and then that becomes, but you know, in theory, those rights revert at a certain point. But that's been the kind of driving media narrative in the music business, these buying up of these things. But it certainly great people at this company Hypnosis, but it's been shown to be not quite a solid model, and there's been a lot of ructions and a lot of pulling back on that enthusiasm to do these things because perhaps they were inflating the kind of residuals that would be coming back from stuff in order to kind of get these catalogs and these artists that would then entice others to come. And so that's been this crazy wave that's happened recently in the publishing side of things.
Yeah.
But that still remains a kind of big driver of revenue in the music business. Why these companies like Warner Chappell and ATV are just doing incredibly well just by having these mostly classic songs, you know? Because if you think about it, there are so few new pop artists like you can kind of name them in on one hand, you know, Dua Lipa and Chappell Roan, I guess. Like, it's so rare for someone, and certainly in Chappell Roan's case, you could say that they completely did it themselves, and had they been aligned only to some record company trying to bang people over the head with it, it might not have won. But because they kind of knew how to make their own content, their own videos, and build up their own, you know, persona, that kind of takes it into a stratosphere that almost planning it can't at this point because of the vagaries of online stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like, well, like one person who's an absolute lightning rod for controversy, Scooter Braun, right? And he found a bunch of young artists at a really early age and helped them build social media platforms and help them find ways of getting their music out.
He's clearly an amazing finder and nurturer of talent, and I think if he's having issues, it seemed from an entirely subjective position that he had sort of. Perhaps the business had matured and he was kind of had his eye a little bit off the ball maybe, and some of his artists were, because, you know, artists are not the easiest people to work with in the world, and I work with some cool ones, but it's funny to me when during the strike, you know, when there was this talk about, which had a development yesterday about AI, you know, using AI to write scripts, or, you know, and that this was like one of the big sticking points of the WGA and the actors. Like, obviously you're not going to like make entirely AI films or TV shows, and the execs, you could be like, well, wouldn't be the worst thing. And like, you could see they weren't averse to the idea of cutting the talent out of the equation because, you know, I guess it's their job to try to make stuff cheaply. And certainly I've steered a bit clear of the AI, but I can't help but, you got to think, if you're someone that loves Friends or whatever, and if they could make some new Friends episodes, if you've exhausted every episode, and in theory, it seems like that would be something you could do.
I think we're like 5 years away from some 16-year-old kid in a basement making an entire animated film by himself, by him or herself, with AI.
Conservative, I think, next week possibly. But I certainly find myself thinking, like, there's some song I love and it like ends too soon, and I don't know why I couldn't just feed it in and say, can you just make this go on another 3 minutes, or, you know, I mean, obviously it's a concern in my space, one that I feel it'd be futile to kind of rail against because it's going to happen as it happens. But this idea that, music, that AI is this kind of existential threat, and certainly, there's probably the kind of premier classy like trailer composers, a guy in Australia who put something up on Facebook that was like, I just made this with AI. It took 10 seconds.
Mm-hmm.
And everyone kind of clutching their pearls and like it's all over. And it might be, I just feel from my point of view, there's perhaps too many people in that chain who are relying on humans doing it to make a living, that it's not really in their interest. I guess there could be a guy at the top who wants to cut everyone out and just say, let's use only AI music in this trailer or whatever. And I've certainly had clued in friends of mine show me commercials and stuff that are entirely AI made, from the image to the music, and they look perfectly plausible,
Yeah.
And I sometimes muse that like music is inherently like aspirationally mathematical, in the sense that music is like well, not always, but in its most basic form, 4 beats to the bar, and the tighter it is, the more it's kind of considered good. And then you have harmony and melody, that you have this idea of if a tone is cycling at 440 hertz, then it's like in tune. And clearly there's something about harmony that if you play a chord that is pleasing or sad, as humans we somehow inherently know how to react to that.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's like disharmony, which just, maybe if you're an alien you wouldn't hear it, but if you play a sort of clanging wrong bass note with it, it just sounds disharmonious, and that's all mathematical, in that it's about cycles working together. And so music, a bit like Icarus, aspires to be mathematically perfect, but it's somehow in humans' inability to recreate it perfectly. In that sort of shortfall is where I'd like to imagine art happens, our inability to make it perfectly. And I kind of like to think like if you ever played like a demo patch on a synthesizer keyboard, that you might see at Guitar Center or something, and it plays this mathematically perfect music that just is appalling and isn't actually music, but it's perfect.
Mm-hmm.
And so I kind of like to kid myself that computers will never be able to create the fallibility of humans, but I imagine it would take about 5 minutes to program a computer to be fallible, probably.
Instead of running at 100% occupancy or 100% efficiency, it goes down to like 98, and then you get that human error.
Yeah. It's like I saw a TikTok story of someone's made the robot from Interstellar, the sort of 3-paneled metal thing.
Mm-hmm.
Someone's made that, and they talk to it, and it's clearly got some pretty good AI in it. And in this video, they were like, well, let's turn up your humor setting from 25% to 75%. And this could all be canned and pre-programmed, I don't know. But, suddenly the computer was like, get ready for some big laughs, It was like, tell us a joke. And I think the joke was like, why don't scientists believe in atoms? Because they make up everything. And I guess the difference with the AI stuff is that a joke that someone's programmed into it, or is it able to actually understand the notion of humor and create that joke out of the idea of what might be funny, which seems like music, almost the hardest, because with music you're trying to evoke an emotion in someone.
Mm-hmm.
And comedians, which I love, comedy, are trying to generate a reflex action. When someone hits your knee and your knee flies up, that's essentially what making someone laugh is. And that just seems like an amazing feat.
Yeah.
But I guess there's no reason computers won't fucking do that.
You know what I saw recently? I saw Steve Martin live in LA here. He was giving a talk about the new documentary that came out on Apple Plus about his life and his career.
Meaning to watch it.
Yeah, and he had a great line in it. He said when he was doing stand-up comedy, at the height of his popularity in the early 80s, late 70s and stuff like that, where he was doing arenas, he would watch other comedians and they would do that like knock the knee, wait for the leg to kick up reflex, right? But he thought like, what if I make the audience feel so awkward that they don't laugh?
Right.
And we just take all the air out of the room, and then eventually they start to laugh later because they don't know what reaction to give out. And it was just like a complete backwards analogy.
Andy Kaufman did the most. But yeah, I think as a comedian, I presume the way you use space and pausing must be almost as much, that's, and again, if we're talking about the analogy of can computers make music, certainly if you listen to comedians, they'll say they have material that's strong, but they learn to do it in front of an audience, testing it, and they'll find that the same joke, if they put like a pause between two words or even purposefully fuck up one of the words or something, will suddenly get a big laugh that it didn't if they said it the other way. And I guess that's stuff that requires an audience to kind of get a handle on. But I sound like an idiot trying to say that we can somehow hold this back. I mean, if it becomes that trailer music and pop music and everything is, I imagine it will be a sort of two-state solution where there'll be this world of fake music and this world of real music. And certainly you see people like Grimes, the Canadian pop singer, wanting to get out ahead of this and saying, yeah, totally, make some of Grimes' records AI. I just want to like share in the royalties. And so you're either going to kind of swim with that tide or try to swim against it and drown, probably.
So what was it? How did you make this transition, being an A&R man to now running your own?
Ran out. All of that was as much as say the recorded music business fucking died a death.
Yeah.
I happen to remember in the year, one of the years I worked at Sony, Michael Jackson died, and Sade put a record out finally after 15 years. Sade, one of the few like 100% positive people in the world. I think anyone doesn't like Sade. She's like the Tom Hanks of the music biz or whatever. And those two things kind of saved the record company for a minute. But basically that game was a little bit up. And so I came out of that, a little bit adrift, was working for a very cool French company who have an artist called Gesaffelstein and The Blaze. And there were some people I'd met along the way who were beautiful, lovely people who let me work for them. I was the creative director of Club Silencio, David Lynch's club in Paris. Weird music biz stuff. Like there's this guy called Michel Polnareff who's this just mega star in France. He's like Michael Jackson meets Elvis Presley in France. And he was like living out in Palm Springs, an older guy. And they wanted to get this record out of him, and everyone they sent out there, he would like literally chase them off his land with a shotgun. Some guy from Universal in Paris called me and said, like, could you try? And I'd kind of try. I was a little bit out of work. I'd like drive out to Palm Springs and have these just shipping a movie out of it or something. These crazy long days with this fairly eccentric French megastar, and just slowly realizing that he wasn't going to kind of make a record and he was just going to kind of keep sort of juicing these labels along. But, just trying to keep it together in the space a little bit and earn a living. And I was kind of raising two children by myself and stuff. And so all a little bit scary. And then literally on the schoolyard one day, a guy I know and now love, who's a giant editor now of Star Wars and stuff like that, he said to me, because he kind of knew I was in music, said, do you know how to make trailer music? I was like, trailer? Of course, I love trailer music. I had no idea what he was talking about, but just sort of thought, just whatever I can get going at this point.
Never say no.
Exactly. Fake it till you make it, whatever. And he said, well, we need to do this terrible Eddie Murphy movie, and can you do this cover of a U2 thing? And I'm literally just like, patching together something on Proto GarageBand and having someone I knew sing this song on their phone and send me the vocal and just throwing it together, and it somehow like worked and won and got into the thing, And then I was like, wow, okay. And they like paid really well, And so I started doing a little bit more of that, and then somebody introduced me to my partner now in work, Felix. Said, this guy's a really talented composer. We were sort of, how can we do something with this? And then we went into, there's a company called Pusher, who were the kind of real first movers in trailer music, still around. And, you know, we said, well, we're doing this. And they said, well, we'll rep you. And so we kind of became part of their team.
Mm-hmm.
But, and that was cool doing, you know, early Mission Impossible. So, you know, cool placements. And we were really with the best of the best. And, but I just had a certain amount going on myself because of my connections to the J.J. Abrams people and some other, and I was just making a little bit too much stuff happen outside of our agents. And at a certain, and we felt like there was maybe a better method if we could get the notes and stuff a little more directly. And so at a certain point, I went to those guys and said, I really think like you should give us our own little fiefdom here and maybe give us a little stake in what we're doing outside. And I think they just like laughed me out of the building. So we were like, okay, well, let's go and set up our own thing. And we did that and kind of were quite assiduous about not like taking any of their clients or relationships or anything. I didn't feel good about it, you know, but just, I guess through some confluence of, you know, amateur luck and perhaps being good at it, just things kicked off quite quickly. And then we did that Force Awakens thing and Batman, Superman, and some other just big stuff that just put us quite in demand in that space. And that just led to us, like I say, bringing on more talent and shifting a bit more into the role of being agents and managers. And because being creative, Kyle, they'll kill you fast, you know? And you're out there.
That's true.
Spending all night, like, you know, working on stuff. It's definitely, I've done it, but it's like being able to make a living out of people more talented than oneself is definitely something I'm grateful for.
Absolutely. Well, look, I know you've got some things you got to take care of today. But look, thank you so much for coming by and walking me through this.
This wasn't too boring and parochial.
No, it was just
good stories from the rest of my life.
It's wild because music is just a space I don't know anything about. Like,
right.
I watch a Taylor Swift documentary, I watch a Nickelback documentary, I watch, you know,
you can pick up a lot from those things. I mean, I think apart from the more like music and label and publishing and all that, I think a lot of people still think of music as being almost like voodoo. Like when you actually break down, there's like a kick drum playing the drums and a guy's playing bass on top of that, and then there's a guitar. But I think a lot of people just hear music like this kind of magical soup. Like they don't necessarily know, you know, what's making it. They just know if they like it or not.
Well, I always love the nuts and bolts of the business. Like there's a great Tom Petty documentary, and I love Tom Petty forever, and he passed sadly. But he was saying, like, you know, how he was making all this music for Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. And then he was writing all this stuff, and the label didn't like the stuff he was writing. So he's like, fuck it, I'm just going to make my own.
Right.
And that ended up being like Free Falling, Last Dance with Mary Jane.
Business is always, you know, it's funny. Just literally now we were talking about a lot of the stuff we do, and I will get out of here, but we'll do it for one project, like I was saying, with the Batman, and then it might end up in something else, you know. And we'd done some Johnny Cash stuff for
I fucking love Johnny Cash.
For Fast and Furious 9 or 10, I can't remember, didn't get in, but then that kind of exists, the work we've done, and then that was just picked for the Craven the Hunter campaign, the same, and then they were just asking us about what we'd used in the assets. But that has this famous story that if you my parents were always like, what does a record producer do? And the answer is it could be anything. It could be like a lot of stuff, like the people that make the high-end pop music, like, you know, Dr. Luke and Max Martin and stuff. They are incredible artisans who make most of the radio pop music that you hear, you know. And a lot of people think pop music's like selling out or something, but actually those are all the very best people, the best programmers, the best songwriters, the best musicians, kind of doing something quite left field, but packaging it in a kind of very pop way. Like, if you listen to Olivia Rodrigo's album and stuff, it's kind of amazing and like challenging in left field. It's just part of a kind of industrial pop music complex thing. But so the point was that Johnny Cash went to Rick Rubin's house in Malibu, and they said, let's just do some recordings of the songs you're thinking about covering, you know, and he just set up a stool and a single mic and he recorded it. And then they went off and redid it all with a fucking orchestra and 1,000 musicians, and then they listened to it and they're like, that shit we recorded at your house is just kind of better. And that's the record they put out that won like every Grammy. So as a producer, I'm sure, you know, I'm not speaking for Rick Rubin, I'm sure he would, it's, being a producer is whatever happens between a performance and a record. And that could be nothing, or in the case of a pop record, it could be just like so much stuff that you wouldn't believe. But those are the choices you got to make. But
it seems like a total Wild West experience.
In as much as there's no telling what will, and so many stories are like that, like the record that they didn't like, or, you know, there was a cast off from the album. And I think all that's changed because online stuff has just made everything inherently much more democratic and sort of Marxist in a way that people choose what's big, you know, and you're no longer having these gatekeepers of just these labels and them ordaining what you're going to like. It's really like people tell them what they like and pay a massive check to someone to get involved. But
I mean, I probably consume most of my music via YouTube.
Yeah, they are the biggest single platform in a way that, as somebody who's, it's sort of, I hate not really knowing, just because I'm a bit out of that game, how those royalties flow. I'm sure they're just sort of scrambling to try to like make deals and sort all that out. But I know it's just kind of remains quite nebulous because it used to be just like you made the money you made from selling records, and then you made the royalties you made as a songwriter from the radio and syncs. Syncs is the word for when you put something in a TV show or movie. But now it's like, yeah, how people are getting paid. I'm sure there are people who know, but it's become very mysterious.
Yeah. It's all up to the accountants now.
Yeah, the number crunchers.
Yeah.
And the wonks. All right.
Well, look, thank you so much for swinging by and educating me about music. Holy cow.
I don't speak too much.
No, I love it. It's just a space that I'm not too familiar with, but hopefully, you know, people out there are learning about what it takes to get music into movies. And
yeah, well, my company's called Cavalry, by the way. Not really selling anything particularly, but we have a nice website, and I think it is interesting to look at those trailers and see how music's marrying to them, and it's definitely a thing. I mean, it's cool. It's like, as I say, there's huge forums and people obsess about trailer music, and I certainly listen to a bunch of it for fun. It can be a little bit of an assault on the ears if you try to listen to too many of those tracks in a row, because they're just all turned up to 11, to quote the great Spinal Tap. But
amplify.
That's been this great. No, that's another, the mastering of music. It used to have, you see, but now everything is like a flat line, and if you see it as a file, because everything has to be so loud.
Yeah. Well, look, we can go up here to this, and we can show people that we're in the same room. No Zoom call today.
Ryan,
thank you very much. Thank you for swinging by. Great to meet you.
Yeah.
And stay safe out there. Keep making great music.
That's the plan. Okay.
All right. Cheers.
Thanks.